We are all yours.
Okay, ready?
When you are.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me in your class. I am looking forward to this presentation and the discussion afterwards. My name is Hannah Evans, and I work as a senior analyst at an organization called PopulationConnection. And PopulationConnection is a US-based nonprofit organization that advocates for increased US funding for family planning programs internationally. And in addition to a lot of the advocacy work we do, we are also very invested in education and outreach about population in general, population studies, demography, and how humans essentially relate to the broader society and the environment. A lot of my focus as a researcher here is to look at the connections between population and climate change. So we're going to be doing that throughout the presentation today. And ultimately, what our organization argues and what I'm going to put forth is that better and more expanded access to human rights, like healthcare in particular and education for women and girls, is really necessary for us to fully combat the climate crisis. These are developmental solutions that, in addition to being really important to sustainable development, are also really integral for climate adaptation, resilience building, and even mitigation strategies. And just quickly before we get into the presentation, just to give you more of a theoretical basis for our organization's work. So we utilize what's called a PHE, or a population health and environment approach to developmental solutions. So that means that the crux of our work is very integrative, right? We're not looking at things necessarily in silos or in isolation from one another, but rather really invested in examining the relationship between issues, what's causing people to interact with their environments, for example, in particular ways, how socioeconomic status, geographic location, gender, sex, sexuality, race, everything kind of comes into play with regards to access to resources, development, and again, how people are interacting with their environment. So as an environmental organization, of course, we're very interested in understanding how population growth affects, the environment. But also as a human rights organization, we're interested in understanding why population growth is occurring, why high fertility rates occur in which places, and what that has to do, again, with the broader sort of social and economic structures in place, what that has to do with poverty, marginalization, lack of access to resources, low status of women, and so on. And so utilizing a PHE framework, we can say that, yes, we need to slow population growth, but the best way to do that is to, relieve poverty, is to increase the status of women, is to, make sure that everybody everywhere has access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care so that they can make autonomous decisions about their lives. And within a climate change context, this is very relevant because all of these sort of factors that I was talking about yield sustainable development that improves health and well-being, that improves food security and lessens pressure on the environment, and ultimately creates climate resilience. So more and more, this kind of strategy is I think, is becoming more and more relevant and possible to ignore, right? Which is the premise that the health of humanity is very intertwined with and dependent on the health of the planet and vice versa. And again, a lot of my focus is on the connections between population and climate change. So looking at the ways in which humans are impacting and impacted by a progressively warmer planet. It's no surprise to anyone that we're experiencing, warmer than average temperatures in many places throughout the world. And there are also many places that are actually breaking records for heat. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's, I think, most well-renowned, respected, and also the most conservative assessment of climate change, has now finally come out recently and unequivocally said that human influence is contributing to the global temperature increases that we're seeing. that are contributing to these mounting climate impacts. And of course, unless we collectively and as a global community work to avert and mitigate and reduce CO2 emissions on a broad and global scale, climate impacts are just going to continue to increase, and the trajectory of climate change could get to the extent that it's going to cascade out of control and at a certain point be uncontrollable. But as the IPCC also clearly knows, and so do other organizations working on this, we still have time to avert the worst possible situation here. We have time to alter the evolution and trajectory of climate change in ways that would allow us to control, to a certain extent, what happens. That means saving millions and billions of lives. That means, creating a much more habitable planet for the present and in the future. Like, all of this is very possible. It's not too late, but we need to be approaching this with like really acute urgency, right? Recognizing that we don't have any time to waste and that we need to use every modality that we have available in order to tackle this crisis. And ultimately, I think what that means, if we're interested in really understanding like how to properly tackle the climate crisis, we need to understand that it is the result of many different interconnected challenges facing our world today, much of which are of our own creation, right? Population growth is one of many different aspects of this. It's one really monumental and important piece of a much broader and complex puzzle, right? Certainly, for example, just the way that our economy has been structured, at least since the Industrial Revolution, is really endangering us fundamentally, right? Because among other things, it's encouraging economies of scale types of production and consumption of fossil fuels, which are causing climate change, of commodities, which are fueling deforestation, also causing climate change, an economic structure that values overconsumption and waste production, and the consumption of commodities like meat, which are fueling really large-scale environmental and health crises all over the planet. All really daunting, again, interconnected issues. But again, what's really important to understand in conceptualizing all of this is that, we as humans have created these processes and these incentives which are driving our world economy, which means that we have the power to change it and to fix it and to create a better, more equitable and more sustainable present and future. And so in terms of the connections between population and climate change, or population and the environment, I think many are pretty well known, right? Worldwide, that we're affecting the planet in many different ways. We're destroying wildlife habitats, causing species to go extinct. We're changing the chemistries of the oceans. We're using resources at unsustainable rates. And as we're all well aware, we're contributing to climate change. And historically, many environmentalists have been, I think, concerned with the continued growth of the human population for many reasons, but primarily because we understand that population growth usually correlates pretty linearly to increases in resource use, consumption patterns, waste production, and so on. And in a macro global context, we can see that this is to an extent true, right? We can see that a variety of different ecological issues have increased in lockstep with population growth over time. I've included 5 examples here, but there are many more that I could, use to kind of substantiate this point. This is a really nuanced and complex conversation, and we're going to get into the complexities of that, later on in the presentation. But this is something that we need to be comfortable talking about, and we need to understand, right? There is a direct correlation between the continued growth of the human population and ecological decline from various standpoints. The Global Footprint Network, which is a great organization that produces ongoing research assessing the Earth's capacity to regenerate its resources versus human demands, has recently published research concluding that humanity now demands 60% more of our planet than its ecosystems can renew. But in order to maintain 85% of the world's biodiversity, which is really necessary for us to create and maintain a sustainable planet, human demand really should only be using half of what the planet can provide. So this means that the current demand exceeds that goal by at least a factor of 3. And again, I want to make sure that we understand that there are many different reasons for this. There are many different contributing factors to ecological imbalance, environmental decline and degradation, climate change. We could talk all day about the different contributing factors. Certainly fossil fuel production, corporate influence, like we could get into the geopolitical aspects of this, the capitalist sort of influence of all of this for sure, and it's very related. But one of the most important factors behind this growing imbalance is the continued growth of the human population. This is something that is not, widely kind of considered, I think, at this point, and there's some real aversions to talking about this relationship. I think some of the reasons for this are well-founded and historically relevant. And so I want to take this next slide to kind of tease out some of the maybe underlying assumptions that dissuade people from approaching this topic more openly. I'm going to do this as a way of kind of confronting the dominant narrative, but then also hopefully giving us a jumping off point for discussion. So the first reason that I think, in mainstream terms that, it's sort of uncommon nowadays to talk about population and the environment is the assumption that population is going to be pit against consumption. And this narrative is really commonly used as a way of kind of arguing that talking about population as it relates to the environment or climate change is inherently unethical or unethical or immoral. And that's because if we were to linearly compare population growth and consumption patterns, we would see very quickly that a really small percentage of the global population consumes the overwhelming majority of the Earth's resources and produces really disproportionate amounts of CO2, right? Population growth alone is not the sole or number one contributor to large-scale environmental damage. That's something that needs to be made clear. But that's not actually, what we're talking about with regards to population and the environment. What we're really ultimately saying is that investing in smaller families yields a variety of social, economic, and environmental benefits, and ultimately creates a better, more equitable future for people. As we're going to get into, there's a direct relationship between fertility rates and level of development, in that when women, girls, and families and communities gain access to more resources, fertility rates naturally drop. Slower population growth ensues, right? So this lessens localized pressure on the environment and creates a better platform from which societies can develop. We'll get into that in a few slides. The second assumption is kind of to view population issues as being fundamentally racist, classist, misogynistic, or xenophobic. And I think that this assumption has a lot of historical relevancy, right? The population movement, which started largely in North America in the 1960s and 70s, really produced a lot of alarmist messaging, saying that if we didn't tackle population growth, very quickly and in a short amount of time and in a broad scope, then it would be apocalyptic. There would be large-scale famines, environmental change, and the world would end, right? And so, that narrative, not only did it not end up playing out, right? Because we found out through the Green Revolution that it was possible for us to produce a lot more food on a lot less land, and therefore we were able to grow our populations even more. But also the result of those narratives were coercive population control measures that were implemented in countries like, most notably, India and China, that controlled from a top-down structural perspective the amount of children that people were able to have, and their reproductive autonomy was stripped, right? This was done in a way to control populations because it was thought of as being an environmental imperative. And ultimately, it was very racist, classist, misogynistic, and xenophobic. Population control measures of any kind, pro-natalist, anti-natalist, whatever, are inherently cruel, coercive, and unwanted. There's no room for them in our world, right? But what we need to be talking about, and where the conversation needs to be focused, is on access to comprehensive reproductive health care being a fundamental human right for which everybody, to which everybody should have access, right? Everybody deserves the ability to choose when, whether, and with whom to become pregnant. And we know that statistically speaking, this ultimately yields lower fertility rates, but most fundamentally, it is a human right and something that everybody needs access to. The third issue is the sort of tendency to assume that population studies is entangled with the use of like trigger words. Population control is a really good example of a trigger word, right? Which, as we were just talking about, rightly carries a lot of historical baggage. I think that whenever we're talking about population and the environment, it's really important to educate yourself about, the history of population studies and why issues are contentious and what language is appropriate to use, really centering things like empathy and compassion within the broader dialogue and within the approach overall. And to be clear, again, population control is not anything that anyone focused on human rights or development or sustainability would ever advocate for, right? What we're talking about is empowerment and respect for people, respect for the environment, respect for the global community, and for the broader societies in which we're all living. The fourth is the perception that there's a lot of religious barriers that are intertwined with population and the environment. And that's because, whenever we're talking about slowing population growth in a voluntary context, ultimately what we mean is greater access to family planning and reproductive health care. That sort of can be boiled down to, being related to emotionally, morally charged issues like that of abortion. It's one reason I think a lot of environmental organizations don't really touch the subject as well. And just to be clear, religion does not have to be a barrier to broader uptake of family planning services and reproductive health care overall. There are many examples throughout Latin America, for example, where countries that exist amidst a really fundamentalist kind of Catholic religious influence have been able to bring their fertility rates down to largely stabilized situations in voluntary contexts because the government has elected to make contraceptives and reproductive health care more broadly available. Not necessarily talking about abortion, but that's also the case depending on where we're talking about. But the biggest indicator of whether or not people will utilize family planning services and contraceptives and slow population growth in that way is whether they have access, right? Iran is another example, and I hesitate to even use this country as an example because it's recently reversed its population policies. But it's a country that has is considered a success story with regards to better access to reproductive care and slowing population growth. So in the 1950s, Iran had one of the highest fertility rates in the entire world. The average woman was having 7 children per woman. The country recognized that that was not advantageous at all for their economic growth and stability. And so through the solicitation of help with religious leaders and broad level kind of PR campaigns advertising the benefit of family planning and through making contraceptives widely available and free, they were able to bring their fertility rates down from, again, one of the highest in the world to one well below replacement level, meaning that the population was stabilized over time. They did this in a matter of years in a completely voluntary way. And again, despite a really heavy religious influence. So whenever we're talking about population and the environment and it becomes about the sort of religious or cultural barriers, it's important also to remember to stick to the facts about population and developments and how they're kind of intertwined and related.
Hannah, can I intervene? Could you
Yeah.
please clarify what is the replacement rate?
Yeah.
Just for the students to know.
Yes, sure. So total fertility rate within a country refers to the total amount of children per woman on average. So in Iran, if the fertility rate is 7, then the average person in Iran is having 7 children over the course of their lifetimes. Replacement level fertility refers to the number 2.1, which means that, or 2.0, which means that over the course of people's lifetimes, the average children per woman is 2, which means that 2 people replace the parents, and therefore the population stabilizes over time. And most industrialized places, fertility rates are at or below replacement level. Does that make sense?
Thank you. And one thing to maybe mention, you're probably going to say later, but with the life expectancy to be growing in most developed nations, going from 60 years to 70 years to now reaching 80 years. So that replacement level means that population eventually stabilize for several decades. Is that correct?
It's going to eventually stabilize. Is that what you said?
Correct. Is that
Yes.
true?
Yes, and
But it's not going to decline. So there is not a population decline, even if people reach the 2.0 or 2.1 replacement level, right?
Are you talking on a global scale or according to specific countries?
No, I will say at the global scale, that will be the case, right?
Yes. So at the global scale, the population is on a trajectory to stabilize, but that's not going to happen until after the end of the century.
Okay.
And that's because there's just a really large amount of young people as a share of our total population. It's disproportionate. So a lot of people are coming into reproductive age in comparison to the older generations or the younger ones, which means that the population is just going to continue to grow even if fertility rates drop immediately and right now. That's a concept called population momentum. And if that doesn't make sense, we can talk about it more too in the discussion, but hopefully as we get into the presentation, it'll be clarified a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the final kind of barrier that I at least see for talking about population and the environment more openly is the tendency to use false or absolute statements whenever we're talking about these global issues that we're all facing. You know, climate change and any global issue is massive, it's complex, and there's a lot of different contributing factors, right? The assertion that there's one problem and one solution to any global problem, especially climate change, but to anything, is just a wild oversimplification. And it's really not the point, right? The point is that we're trying to look at what integrated solutions mean. How do we address like broad systems change? That's through addressing or investing development strategies that simultaneously address social, economic, and environmental inequities within societies. Like we're looking at the whole picture here, not one issue in isolation from everything else. And this is just a graph that was showing kind of what I was talking about with Iran. As you can see, it brought its fertility rate down really drastically in a number of years. And they did this again amidst a really heavy religious influence and in an entirely voluntary way, just by giving people access to resources, just by making contraceptives widely available, and by advertising kind of the benefits associated with smaller families. Those are 2 stamps there that kind of echo what I was just saying. Okay, so in terms of, if we're going to zoom out a little bit again and look at the world population and why it's such a big issue, one of the main reasons for this is that the world's population has essentially skyrocketed in a really short amount of time and at times been exponential. So for most of human history, life expectancy was very low. birth rates were really high, fertility rates were really high, but death rates were also really high, right? We were in these really kind of precarious situations for most of human history that allowed us to maintain a really stable kind of population growth trajectory. That happened until 1700, 1750 with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, which occurred first in North America and Europe and then spread across the globe, which resulted in large-scale advancements in sanitation, public health, access to broader resources, food production, technology, and so on. That caused death rates to fall so significantly that we're now adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. So up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. Now we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 11 to 12 years. This year, we're going to have 8 billion people on the planet. That's like, it's like almost impossible to kind of fathom in our heads, like how big that number is. It's impossible for me to even kind of conceptualize how big the number 1 billion is, but we have 8 billion people on the planet. This is a huge number. It's completely out of balance, right? This is nobody's fault, but like, this is, look at the chart. It's grown so quickly in such a short amount of time. In 300 years, it's mushroomed to 8 billion people, right? And so even though death rates are falling, death rates are depicted there in the purple line, as the professor was kind of alluding to, because there's such a huge base of population, and because our population, our global population in terms of age structure is very young, our global population is going to continue to grow into 2100 regardless of anything. Even if everybody right now in all societies throughout the world just reached replacement level fertility, we would still continue to grow our population. Again, this is a concept called population momentum. So we do know eventually that the global population is going to stabilize, right? But the big questions are, when is this going to happen exactly? How many people will there be when this does happen? And will we be able to avert the imminent threats posed by climate change in enough time to save lives and to, again, kind of alter the trajectory and the course of climate change? And so now we're going to get into a little bit more of the complexities of this conversation. Worldwide, fertility rates are completely different according to where you are in the world. And there are many places on the planet that actually have at replacement level fertility or below replacement level fertility, meaning that their populations are stabilized or even declining in some cases. As you can see, the places that are experiencing the most acute population growth are the least developed countries in the less developed regions. So again, there's a really direct correlation here between level of development and population growth. While more developed regions have lower fertility rates, they have higher carbon footprints. Less developed countries have lower carbon footprints, but higher rates of population. So this is like a complex conversation, right? We need to get into the nuances of this. This is kind of a pictorial example of what I was just saying, but worldwide, fertility rates are highest in some of the most marginalized places on Earth. Most of Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Latin America and Asia. And right here, it's, again, really important to make the distinction that this is very, very clearly indicating that population growth alone is not the sole number one or exclusive contributor to large-scale environmental damage or to climate change. If that logic were true, it would somehow indicate that the poorest populations on the planet, oftentimes people making less than $2 a day, are contributing the most amount of environmental harm. This is just very clearly not true, but it's a dangerous oversimplification that has been used before, and it's just not an accurate statement. But it's really important for us to know from a demographic perspective where populations are going to grow most significantly into the next century. That helps us kind of understand everything, social, economic, and environmental issues, but also kind of weigh the potential impacts of climate change, right? So this is a graph sort of depicting that information. showing where the populations throughout the world are going to grow most significantly into the next century. And in terms of demographic shifts and what they mean for the environment, for demands on resources, and for consumption patterns, it's really important to understand what's happening globally. So if we look at the world population, I think it's common to assume that we've all been taught, right, that there's like two worlds. There's a developed world and a developing world. Hans Rosling, who was a famous statistician and demographer, has kind of called that out as being a wild oversimplification, and instead has created levels, 4 different levels based off of relative income and population size. And as you can see, the majority of the world's population resides on levels 2 and 3. These are what are called middle income or emerging economies. This is like 5 billion people, or 80% of the world's population resides in these levels 2 and 3. And they're in the process of industrialization. So just like every industrialized nation that exists right now on Earth, they're undergoing this process by which they're experiencing greater access to resources that are allowing people to live healthier, better lives, greater access to education, greater access to healthcare, more financial discretion in terms of what they have access to, what kind of what things are allowed, they're able to buy, whether they be bikes or cars or airplanes or whatever, right? All of these processes that kind of come in accordance with industrialization are amazing, right? We've created this like linear trajectory for growth based off of this particular economic system. And most of the world is like now coming into where they're supposed to be, right? Our definition of success. This yields so many different social, economic, and environmental, well, not necessarily environmental, but social and economic benefits to society. And it's certainly something that we as members of industrialized nations cannot deny anyone else. And this isn't about that at all. It's not about like looking at or trying to control how people are living, but rather recognizing that 5 billion people, 80% of the world's population, is now coming into these higher levels of developments and going to be consuming at greater rates, having higher demand on resources. So what is that going to mean for global environmental degradation that is set forth by waste production, by consumption patterns, by pollution, and so on, right? This is just something that we need to understand and really integrate better into our systems and our solutions. Right now, I don't think it's being discussed. I think, most prominently, this also really speaks to the very urgent need, alongside slowing population growth, to change the way that we're producing food and energy. Another aspect of the population and climate change conversation is that of climate vulnerability. So if we're looking at the least developed countries on the planet, these are the places that are also the fastest growing. So many least developed countries are going to continue to experience rapid population growth between now and 2050. From a climate change perspective, this presents a lot of problems, right? Because these are the lowest income regions, oftentimes the most climate vulnerable places. And so, you're going to have more people who are at risk of experiencing climate impacts who lack the ability or capital to readily respond or recover. This is a huge climate justice issue for many reasons, but of course also because these populations are not contributing at all to the global environmental crisis that we're experiencing, and yet are incurring the most severe effects. And so again, we can look and see that fertility rates are directly correlated with poverty. So places that are considered marginalized without access to vital resources like healthcare, sanitation, education, that have a low status of women, low economic outputs, and so on, tend also to have the highest fertility rates and also the highest unmet need for contraceptives. And again, in terms of climate vulnerability, population pressures in these socioeconomic contexts really endangers people even more, right? So the world's 47 least developed countries are also the fastest growing. many are projected to double in population by 2050. So they're growing really, really quickly in a short amount of time, or really significantly in a short amount of time. So this really increases strain on already scarce resources in a more localized context, and also slows progress in health and economic growth, right? If we look at the top 10 most climate vulnerable countries in the world, we can see that 9 of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa, which is again projected to double just by 2050. To go through a few examples at the country level, the first is Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is about the same size as New York. New York has 20 million people. Bangladesh has 165 million people. So really quickly growing emerging economy. So it's expected to grow really significantly in upcoming years. Many people are moving to the city centers in search of economic opportunity. The country would otherwise be in a really auspicious period of time where they would be developing and industrializing, mechanizing their economies or their economic outputs to participate at higher levels in the world economy. More people would be gaining access to resources that would allow them to increase their standards of living and so on. But because of climate change, this country is constantly kind of battling, or not battling, but just trying to respond and recover from these mounting climate impacts, which act now as the biggest threat to its development. This is entirely unfair, right? Because this is a country that has contributed really meager amounts to global CO2 emissions. And now they're in a process where they should be developing and they should be industrializing, but that development trajectory is being stifled because of mounting climate impacts. Bangladesh is located in a floodplain, so sort of similar to Louisiana in the United States, where a bunch of different tributaries come to a head over the landmass and spill into the bay. Because of that, it's geographically already really susceptible to things like sea level rise and hurricanes and flooding. As you can see, this is taken from a New York Times article in 2020, whenever there was a massive flood over the course of a really short period of time that essentially submerged, I think, over 35% of the country, displaced millions of people, killed tens of dozens of people, and really undermines already precarious infrastructure. This is just a NASA satellite image, again, kind of taken over the course of a month. And as you can see, a huge portion of the country is just literally submerged. It's not the only time that this has happened in Bangladesh. It's happening all across Asia and South Asia. In particular, but it's presenting a lot of really difficult issues from a population perspective of like, countries being in these really desperate situations where they're needing to industrialize and should be developing their economies and slowing population growth through the expansion of human rights, but are now, having to incur these climate impacts that are making it impossible to focus on anything else.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So, there's like a flooding going on. Do you think?
Sorry, I'm not hearing anything.
Isabella, you want to type in the chat? That would be also okay.
I'll just type in the chat.
Okay.
Oh, we hear you now.
Yeah, now we hear you.
Oh, okay. So basically, I was saying like, I was seeing on the news that like in, I believe it's Pakistan, like there's a lot of flooding and stuff like that. Do you think that's due to like the climate change and everything?
Yeah, it's absolutely due to climate change. And whenever we're talking about, like extreme weather events, it's not like a linear one-to-one correlation. It's not as simple as that, right? It's really difficult from a scientific perspective to nail down exactly what's happening and why, but it is related very directly to climate change and to changes in weather patterns that we're seeing as a consequence of CO2 emissions, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think I read a recent like UN report that said that flooding and like water-related disasters like this throughout Asia are made like 30 times more likely because of climate change. And they're just way more intense and severe, right? Okay, so the
Hannah, just to add to what you just say is so in our context is like Puerto Rico. So the moment they finish rebuilding from the last tragedy, they got hit again for another hurricane. So the issues that you are mentioning means that these populations are exposed, and that exposure is going to be year after year. Some years are going to be better than others, but eventually they're going to be hit again. And that's basically the emphasis. The larger the population it grows in some of these places, the less resources they're going to have, and the more of these impacts happening. Of course, that takes all the energy and efforts to get it back. President Biden was talking about Puerto Rico getting rebuilding it better than before, but again, they just finished rebuilding it for the last time.
Yeah, exactly. So population comes into play really significantly here because it exacerbates the effects of climate impacts, and depending on socioeconomic status can be really, really devastating for economic growth and social progress. But it is also true that certain places are more geographically just susceptible to things like hurricanes, extreme weather events, and whatever. So Puerto Rico is in a really unfortunate position just by their own geography, where they're going to be hit, or the risk of them being hit by hurricanes is much higher than it is in other places. And yet they're, also still trying to develop and in sort of these like middle income situations where there's a large wealth disparity and a lack of access to resources. And this needs to be drawn back to like histories of colonization, right? There's like a lot of geopolitical influences here that come into play that create these marginalized statuses for places. But just overall, climate change is kind of highlighting these inequities, I think. Yeah, good points. Thank you. And the second kind of example, country level region level that I'll give with regards to population and climate vulnerability is that of the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa. So the Sahel region is depicted there in the green, and it collectively has the highest population growth rates in the entire world. It's also very low income. So again, there's a direct relationship between low status of women, low income populations, and high population growth rates. As you can see by looking at the graph on the right-hand side, temperatures are also increasing alongside rapid population growth. So temperature rises in the Sahel region are 1.5 times faster than that of the global average. So you've got really quickly growing low-income populations that are trying to survive based off of subsistence or small-scale agriculture that are experiencing these temperature increases that are changing precipitation patterns, that are altering the distribution of and availability of arable land, and creating these situations where people are forced to move in search of food or shelter or whatever. This is fueling conflict. This is creating one of the biggest humanitarian crises, I think, on our planet today. Food security is like, the trajectory at which it becomes an issue or becomes out of control is going so much faster, right? Because of population pressures and because of these climate impacts, right? As you can see, just over the course of a year, food security in the Sahel has kind of burgeoned out of control. And this is just the reality for this particular place. So in these regions, population pressures, because also they are largely a consequence of unmet needs for resources, really exacerbates the issue, and so meeting the unmet need could really help these populations to adapt and to create resilience. And that's kind of the next part of this presentation as we wrap up here, is to introduce that investments in sustainable development, including things like education, healthcare, and women's empowerment, are innovations that could help build resilience and adaptive capacity for all populations, but especially those most at risk. And within those solutions is a really direct need to increase access to comprehensive reproductive health care. So this is really one very important solution to an adaptation strategy for climate change. And just quickly, since we're switching gears a little bit here, and so that we're on the same page, voluntary family planning and reproductive health care most fundamentally, I think, facilitate what's called informed choice, which enables women and couples to freely and responsibly determine the number, timing, and spacing of their births. This is just a fundamental internationally recognized human right. And it also yields a variety of other benefits to society. Of course, health benefits, which I think are a little bit more well known, but also social, economic, and environmental benefits. It's very necessary. It's a very necessary precursor to reducing poverty, to improving livelihoods, to increasing education rates for women and girls, and so on. From an environmental perspective, the reduction of unintended pregnancies and healthier, more educated populations means lower fertility rates, means less pressure on natural resources, less pressure on food production, more stable kind of economic outputs. And over time, this reduces the level of greenhouse gas emissions at the per capita level and reduces climate vulnerability as well. And coupled very essentially with family planning services is that of education. So whenever we're advocating for these developmental solutions, it's usually not enough just to go into a really at-risk region and like increase access to family planning and contraceptives. It's just as important that people and communities and regions are educated, right, and have access to that resource, because among many other things, it really facilitates independent and critical thought, which is very necessary in kind of tackling and overcoming some of the cultural or religious barriers that might otherwise prevent people from utilizing such an advantageous resource. From a more social perspective, whenever education levels rise for women and girls, they gain access to power, to social, political, and economic power. Higher levels of education afford more options for sustained employment and help increase livelihoods. That frees up resources for people to be able to choose when and how to start a family. And, you know, statistically speaking, all across the world, it becomes no surprise to know that whenever women who are educated, or when women who are educated, sorry, I'm like totally botching this sentence, that women who are educated tend statistically to have fewer, healthier children, right? So this is a really integral part of this conversation as well, family planning and education. You can see, similar to kind of the correlation between fertility rates and poverty, there's also a direct correlation between women's educational attainment and the children per woman. So again, this is happening all across the world despite religious or cultural influence. And as we again kind of start to wrap up here, I just like to segue with this quote, because I think it adequately encompasses what I'm trying to say and what our organization really works on. And it says, family planning is not only a matter of human rights, it's also central to women's empowerment, reducing poverty, building climate resilience, and achieving sustainable development. And worldwide, this is kind of what we focus on, because there's a confluence of all of these intersecting compounding issues, right? The same places that are lowest income, that have low status of women, that have low economic outputs, that have high climate vulnerability, also have really high fertility rates and really high unmet needs for contraceptives. So in these regions, especially that are already experiencing a lot of climate impacts and high climate vulnerability, the fact that there's a really high unmet need for contraceptives and family planning signals the opportunity to, you know, implement some solutions here that would help people survive and build resilience and kind of withstand climate impacts in greater capacities. There's a lot of research substantiating the fact that meeting women's needs for family planning and reproductive health directly benefits climate adaptation. And the reasons for this are pretty straightforward. So women and children who are healthier because they gain access to healthcare allows them to, build climate resilience, to respond to and recover from changes in weather patterns, the need to move, or whatever's happening with the climate. Meeting women's needs for family planning and reproductive health also results in empowerment. So this increases possibilities for engaging in adaptation efforts. Through this, rates of unintended pregnancies drop, which results in smaller families and a reduced demand for climate sensitive resources like food and water. And then over time, slower population growth. So this lessens pressure on local and natural resources and exposes fewer people to climate impacts. And finally, in terms of mitigation, or the potential that meeting unmet needs globally for family planning and reproductive health and education can play in offsetting emissions, the potentials here are really compelling, right? So an organization called Project Drawdown produces ongoing research assessing and ranking different solutions to climate change based off of various indicators like upfront cost, return on investment, or emissions offsets. And as you can see, health and education are ranked in the top 5 solutions for climate change, because they can actually contribute to the aversion of over 85 gigatons of CO2 by 2050 alone. And again, this organization ranks different solutions based off of various indicators. And there's actually 82 different solutions that should be listed here. I've only listed 10, but health and education ranks second out of 82 different solutions for potential CO2 emissions offsets, for return on investment, upfront cost, and the potential efficacy of kind of addressing all of the issues within societies that are contributing to climate change. So that's kind of what we work on. With that as a basis, we work to ensure that everybody everywhere has access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care and education, so that they can live autonomous lives, and so that, society can advance, essentially. And right now, there are 218 million women who want to avoid pregnancy, but are not currently using any modern form of contraception. Among other things, among lower health outputs and a variety of other dangers, this results in like 111 million unintended pregnancies annually. If we were able to meet fully the unmet needs for family planning globally, and if everybody was able to receive healthcare at the levels recommended by the World Health Organization, the impacts would be really substantial, right? We would see a 70% drop in unsafe abortions, 60% drop in unintended pregnancies. We would see much better health outcomes. We would see much higher status of women, education rates, and so on.
Hannah, do you have any numbers for how many of these unintended pregnancies come from teenagers and younger women? Is this something that relates to younger women, or is just in general?
Yeah. So this does, I don't have the figure here, but in low-income regions, especially, the incidence of child marriage and of teen pregnancies are much higher. And again, that kind of relates back to what we've been talking about of there's a real lack of access to education, to economic opportunity, to just broader resources like sanitation, healthcare, or healthcare and everything else. So yeah, I think it disproportionately impacts young people, definitely. But I don't
just
have
a follow-up. So in the United States, the legal age is 17 years for women to get married. But in other countries, it's actually lower, 14 years and as low as 12 years.
Yeah, I don't know the exact statistics on that, but I think you're definitely right. And I think that there are movements throughout sub-Saharan Africa, I know in particular, and parts of Asia as well, that are really working through policies and outreach efforts to try to eliminate that. But it's also something that's being exacerbated by climate change, because as subsistence agriculture becomes more and more, or less and less plausible because of changes in weather patterns and whatever, you know, it becomes more advantageous. I don't want to use that word, but it becomes more of an imperative for girls to be married at younger and younger ages, because there's just not enough food to go around. There's not enough stability within food production practices. And so the best option is often to have people marry earlier, which means that they're marrying at like 13, 14, 15 years old. It's a huge problem. And this does relate to this slide, actually, because this is a huge problem throughout the Sahel region. And the use of contraceptives here is pretty much non-existent. It's below 10%. But there's obviously a much higher expressed unmet need, which again signals the potential for interventions, positive interventions that could help people really kind of address and respond to these humanitarian crises that are being faced. Family planning in Bangladesh has actually done very well. The country has invested really heavily in family planning, and as a consequence, been able to reduce their total fertility rates to a level that's considered stabilized. Without having invested in family planning, I think that climate impacts, which are already very devastating, would be much worse. But because, again, as we were talking about, the country is growing so quickly, so many people are moving to the city centers in search of opportunity and so on. The focus really needs to be on expanding even further family planning innovations there. Also recognizing that around 30% of pregnancies are unintended. So from an advocacy perspective, we work to kind of get rid of the barriers from a policy perspective that impact or limit the way that aid is distributed to different family planning organizations in different countries. Right now, with all of the different contributions at the country and sort of at the country level, from the private sector and so on, with all of those contributions combined, there's still an estimated $5.5 billion funding gap for fully meeting family planning needs globally. The United States is consistently the biggest contributor of funding for family planning programs, which means that many different countries and organizations are really depending on our aid. But it represents a really meager or really small percentage of our overall budget. And the main issue is that it's kind of constantly under threat because it's become such a partisan issue. So really depending on who's in power, that can greatly influence it greatly impacts the way aid is distributed, the amount of aid that is distributed, and just our overall kind of stance culturally on family planning and access to contraceptives. So this inconsistent funding stream really puts a lot of barriers up for countries, for organizations that are trying to make progress, but that every 4 years don't receive funding anymore, for example. So we work to kind of streamline those that funding stream and create more consistency. So in conclusion, and we can open it up for questions after this, population growth obviously intersects with climate change in many different ways and ultimately produces climate vulnerability. But slowing population growth through voluntary family planning and education can really have a bunch of positive impacts in terms of adaptation, resilience building, and mitigation. So looking at comprehensive reproductive health care as something that fosters sustainable development, but also greatly reduces climate impacts globally. And finally, I will end here with a quote from Paul Hawken, who is the editor of Drawdown. And he says, "Honoring the dignity of women and children through family planning is not about centralized governments forcing the birth rate down or up through natalist policies, nor is it about agencies or activists in rich countries where emissions are highest, telling people elsewhere to stop having children. It is most essentially about freedom and opportunity for women and the recognition of basic human rights." All right, I'll stop there. And I will put my email in the chat if anyone would like to get in touch with me that way, please do.
That would be fantastic. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much. I think a round of applauses, whatever is the way to do this virtually.
Thanks, everyone.
I think it was very enlightening and a fantastic presentation. We know how difficult all these numbers and data can be to put together in a way that it can be easy to understand to everyone. So we really appreciate you doing all of this for us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm glad that it was well received.
And as a follow-up, we're going to have the classes visiting your website. I don't have, well, the email that you presented to us also can be shared, but then we will have a follow-up definitely from this presentation. I would like to open the room for anybody who has something to comment, a reaction or a question or just feedback. That would be fantastic.
Hello.
Hi.
So I think people were putting their hands up to talk. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I have a question. Is there real population growth in climate insecure countries is crazy, and that's a result of access to healthcare and education and socioeconomic status and so forth. Can we really have that discussion without talking about the extraction economy? I mean, like I heard you say earlier that it's not really about controlling our lifestyle, but our lifestyle is the fuel. We had, for example, in Brazil, Bolsonaro destroying the Amazon, but that's for our beef. That's not for Brazilians.
Yeah.
Beef.
Yep.
That's for our beef. In Puerto Rico, for example, we have a US appointed person that controls all of their money. So it's not colonialism like in the past. It's like right now. It's happening right now. In the Dominican Republic, where I'm from, we have Canadians, mining companies tearing down the mountains. And we can say, you know, the Dominican Republic is Catholic, it's very anti-family planning, you know, so on and so forth, but they do have the resources for their own people, but the resources are being exported to here. So, so is it really possible to speak to people about population growth and climate change without talking about the extraction economy and our role in that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Great questions. This is something that I'm constantly trying to integrate more into our organization's work, because of course it's so intimately related. And that's kind of what I was trying to allude to at the beginning of like recognizing that our economic system and the processes associated with extractive economies and capitalist enterprise and imperialism are fundamentally to blame too, right? I mean, population issues would be completely different if our morals and values and ethics didn't surround consumption, and if extractive economies didn't exist, right? If we weren't going around colonizing different places, making sure that economies are structured in certain ways. In Brazil, for example, to output a lot of agricultural products that are then sold on the world market, consumed by a really small percentage of the global population in exchange for money that's not well distributed throughout the country. Like, that's a completely out of balance system. And I think, yeah, I think one reason why, you know, I like discussing this issue is because it is impossible to talk about population growth and population dynamics and demographic trends and climate change without talking about the needs for systems change. Systems of oppression are simultaneously oppressing people and the environment, you know, and it's all part of this broader structure. So it needs to be.
For example, I have 3 kids. I think if I lived in Bangladesh, I would be able to have like 15 kids with the same amount that my kids have. They're, you know, all the toys. I have a big black SUV. You know, so it's it feels like a lot of these countries would have the resources to increase education, to increase access to family planning, healthcare, to feed their own people, if corruption or whatever and our, you know, our pressures weren't taking their stuff and bringing it here. Because all of the toys and things, that none of them were built here. They're all from other places.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, no, it's really complicated, and at this point, I think that everything needs to be properly historically contextualized. But now we've got a situation where there's like corrupt leaders all over the place, right? And it's been like that for a really long time. Again, the consequence of colonization for sure, but also something that's like even just like grown itself beyond that. And also, whenever we're talking about slower population growth as being an environmental imperative, what we're also saying is like, and what we need to be kind of understanding too, is that like these populations that are going to increase in affluence are then going to be wanting to consume at higher and higher rates. Like that's kind of what I was talking about with middle income countries. Like they're coming into this position where they are gaining more financial discretion, where demands for meat have risen like 80%, right, throughout the world in a really over the past like 50 years or something. And demand for cars is going to increase. The demand on resources is going to increase. And it's not, and what I was saying is like, it's not about saying, oh, you can't do that, we don't have any more resources left, like you can't live your life like that. It's just like that speaks to the vital need to change what we're doing, because we cannot deny people the advancement of their own lives, right? We need to
one of these
make sure that those are sustainable.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh,
No,
one of these climate, you know, hot shots or what, I don't know, Bill McKibben or something, I think made a comment that everybody in the world could be middle class at the level of like 1960s middle class US if we wanted it that way. Like for example, you put up there that like there's a $5.5 billion gap in funding to international healthcare, reproductive healthcare, and then you think to yourself, we're allowing, you know, US billionaires to have hundreds of billions of dollars, you know.
Yeah.
So is the problem really going over there or other places, or is it and trying to help them build infrastructure or whatever, or is it really controlling ourselves? Is our time better spent trying to control ourselves? Will it impact the climate more for us to try to control ourselves?
Yeah,
for all.
I think that's a really good thought provoking like discussion, and something that we all need to kind of be thinking about. You're right that at the most fundamental like systems level of things, it's corrupt, and it's always arguably been like that, right? If we wanted to solve all of the world's problems, we could do it in 2 seconds. We don't, that's very clear, and things are really corrupt, and exploitation is fundamental to capitalism, and there's like all of these huge issues. But I think that it's, you know, recognizing that like a complete and total overthrow of the system is not necessarily like possible or even the point. I think it's important for us as individuals to say, okay, like this is our position within society. I have certain choices. I care about certain things. Like, what is it that I'm really passionate about? What is it that how do I want to make a difference in this world? And focus on that, because the small level, like incremental change at these like lower, more like localized levels, like those are really profound. Those are really radical changes. And it doesn't mean like, you know, if you're an environmentalist, it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I can't ever travel again, or I can't eat, you know, a little bit of meat here and there, or I can't ever do anything. Like, you don't want to get stuck in this like situation of paralysis, or of choosing like, what is the most effective solution overall? We can't know that. What we can know is like, we can make different contributions to the efforts, but we know that the system itself is broken. So what do you as an individual want to do? What is going to help you lead a better, more comfortable life? But that's one that's conscious, one that has empathy and respect for people, for the planet, and for yourself, you know? So it's about like finding out what you're passionate about and going towards that, I think.
Thank you.
Hannah,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Lolita, appreciate your comments and keeping the conversation going. Since it's 3:15, a little past 3:15, I had to stop the class. I can keep the class open for a few more minutes if anybody wants to stay here and reconnect with Hannah. But those of you who has class in a few minutes, I thank you for being here. Remind you to be connected to the classes for the assignments that we have ahead of us, and also for the activities we're going to have this week, in particular the one on Friday. So everybody, thank you for being here. Hopefully you guys got to enjoy. I'm going to be reading those assignments with a lot of attention and joy as usual. I will see you in class the next time. Thank you.
Thanks,
And
everyone.
Hannah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Hope to see you again next semester.
Definitely appreciate it. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.